Part One, Chapter 17 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 17. The widow was alone in the room, standing by the bedside table on which Mr. Keller's night drink was placed. I was so completely taken by surprise that I stood stock still like a fool, and stared at Madame Fontaine in silence. On her side, she was, as I believe, equally astonished and equally confounded, but better able to conceal it. For the moment, and only for the moment, she too had nothing to say. Then she lifted her left hand from under her shawl. "You have caught me, Mr. David," she said, and held up a drawing-book as she spoke. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She pointed with the book to the famous carved mantelpiece. "You know how I long to make a study of that glorious work," she answered. "Don't be hard on a poor artist who takes her opportunity when she finds it." "May I ask how you came to know of the opportunity, Madame Fontaine?" "Entirely through your kind sympathy, my friend," was the cool reply. "My sympathy? What do you mean? Was it not you, David, who considerately thought of Minna when the post came in, and did you not send the manservant to us with her letter from Fritz?" The blubbering voice of Joseph, trembling for his situation on the landing outside, interrupted me before I could speak again. "I'm sure I meant no harm, sir. I only said I was in a hurry to get back because you had all gone to the theatre, and I was left with nobody but the kitchen girl to take care of the house. When the lady came and showed me her drawing-book—" "That will do, friend Joseph," said the widow, signing to him to go downstairs in her easy, self-possessed way. "Mr. David is too sensible to take notice of trifles. There, there, go down." She turned to me with an expression of playful surprise. "How very serious you look!" she said gaily. "It might have been serious for you, Madame Fontaine, if Mr. Keller had returned to the house to fetch his opera-glass himself." "Ah! He has left his opera-glass behind him. Let me help you look for it. I have done my sketch. I am quite at your service." She forestalled me in finding the opera-glass. "I really had no other chance of making a study of the chimney-piece," she went on, as she handed the glass to me. "Impossible to ask Mr. Engelmann to let me in again, after what happened on the last occasion. And, if I must confess it, there is another motive besides my admiration for the chimney-piece. You know how poor we are. The man who keeps the picture shop in the Zeil is willing to employ me. He can always sell these memorials of old Frankfurt to English travellers. Even the few forms he gives me will find 2 half-starved women in housekeeping money for a week." It was all very plausible, and perhaps, in my innocent days before I met Frau Meyer, I might have thought it quite likely to be true. In my present frame of mind, I only asked the widow if I might see her sketch. She shook her head, and sheltered the drawing-book again under her shawl. "It is little better than a memorandum at present," she explained. "Wait till I have touched it up and made it saleable, and I will show it to you with pleasure. You will not make mischief, Mr. David, by mentioning my act of artistic invasion to either of the old gentlemen? It shall not be repeated, I give you my word of honor. There's poor Joseph, too. You don't want to ruin a well-meaning lad by getting him turned out of his place. Of course not. We part as friends who understand each other, don't we? Minna would have sent her love and thanks if she had known that I was to meet you. Good night." She ran downstairs, humming a little tune to herself, as blithe as a young girl. I heard a momentary whispering with Joseph in the hall, then the house door closed, and there was an end of Madame Fontaine for that time. After no very long reflection, I decided that my best course would be to severely caution Joseph, and to say nothing to the partners of what had happened, for the present at least. I should certainly do mischief by setting the two old friends at variance again on the subject of the widow if I spoke, to say nothing, as another result, of the likelihood of Joseph's dismissal by Mr. Keller. Actuated by these reasonable considerations, I am bound frankly to add that I must have felt some vague misgivings as well. Otherwise, why did I carefully examine Mr. Keller's room before I returned to the theatre, without any distinct idea of any conceivable discovery that I might make? Not the vestige of a suspicious appearance rewarded my search. The room was in its customary state of order, from the razors and brushes on the toilet table to the regular night drink of barley water, ready as usual in the jug by the bedside. I left the bedchamber at last. Why was I still not at my ease? Why was I rude enough, when I thought of the widow, to say to myself, "Damn her"? Why did I find Gluck's magnificent music grow wearisome from want of melody as it went on? Let the learned in such things realize my position, and honor me by answering those questions for themselves. We were quite gay at supper. The visit to the theatre had roused the spirits of the two partners, by means of a wholesome break in the monotony of their lives. I had seldom seen Mr. Keller so easy and so cheerful. Always an abstemious man, he exercised his usual moderation in eating and drinking, and he was the first to go to bed. But while he was with us, he was, in the best sense of the word, a delightful companion, and he looked forward to the next opera night with the glee of a schoolboy looking forward to a holiday. End of Chapter 17 of Part 1. Part 1, Chapter 18 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 18. The breakfast room proved to be empty when I entered it the next morning. It was the first time in my experience that I had failed to find Mr. Keller established at the table. He had hitherto set the example of early rising to his partner and to myself. I had barely noticed his absence, when Mr. Engelmann followed me into the room with a grave and anxious face, which proclaimed that something was amiss. "Where is Mr. Keller?" I asked. "In bed, David." "Not ill, I hope?" "I don't know what is the matter with him, my dear boy. He says he has passed a bad night, and he can't leave his bed and attend to business as usual. Is it the close air of the theatre, do you think?" "Suppose I make him a comfortable English cup of tea?" I suggested. "Yes, yes, and take it up yourself. I should like to know what you think of him." Mr. Keller alarmed me in the first moment when I looked at him. A dreadful apathy had possessed itself of this naturally restless and energetic man. He lay quite motionless, except an intermittent trembling of his hands as they rested on the counterpane. His eyes opened for a moment when I spoke to him, then closed again, as if the effort of looking at anything wearied him. He feebly shook his head when I offered him the cup of tea, and said in a fretful whisper, "Let me be." I looked at his night drink. The jug and the glass were both completely empty. "Were you thirsty in the night?" In the same fretful whisper he answered, "Horribly." "Are you not thirsty now?" He only repeated the words he had first spoken. Let me be." There he lay, wanting nothing, caring for nothing. His face looked pinched and wan already, and the intermittent trembling still at regular intervals shaking his helpless hands. We sent at once for the physician who had attended him in trifling illnesses at former dates. The doctor who is not honest enough to confess it when he is puzzled is a well-known member of the medical profession in all countries. Our present physician was one of that sort. He pronounced the patient to be suffering from low or nervous fever, but it struck Mr. Engelmann, as it struck me, that he found himself obliged to say something, and said it without feeling sure of the correctness of his own statement. He prescribed, and promised to pay us a second visit later in the day. Mother Barbara, the housekeeper, was already installed as nurse. Always a domestic despot, she made her tyranny felt even in the sick room. She declared that she would leave the house if any other woman presumed to enter it as nurse. "When my master is ill," said Mother Barbara, "my master is my property." It was plainly impossible that a woman at her advanced age could keep watch at the bedside by day and night together. In the interests of peace, we decided on waiting until the next day. If Mr. Keller showed no signs of improvement by that time, I undertook to inquire at the hospital for a properly qualified nurse. Later in the day, our doubts of the doctor were confirmed. He betrayed his own perplexity in arriving at a true diagnosis of the patient's case by bringing with him, at his second visit, a brother physician whom he introduced as Dr. Dormann, and with whom he asked leave to consult at the bedside. The new doctor was the younger, and evidently the firmer person of the two. His examination of the sick man was patient and careful in the extreme. He questioned us minutely about the period at which the illness had begun, the state of Mr. Keller's health immediately before it, the first symptoms noticed, what he had eaten and what he had drunk, and so on. Next, he desired to see all the inmates of the house who had access to the bedchamber, looking with steady scrutiny at the housekeeper, the footman, and the maid, as they followed each other into the room, and dismissing them again without remark. Lastly, he astounded his old colleague by proposing to administer an emetic. There was no prevailing on him to give his reasons. "If I prove to be right, you shall hear my reasons. If I prove to be wrong, I have only to say so, and no reasons will be required. Clear the room, administer the emetic, and keep the door locked till I come back." With those parting directions, he hurried out of the house. "What can he mean?" said Mr. Engelmann, leading the way out of the bedchamber. The elder doctor, left in charge, heard the words, and answered them, addressing himself not to Mr. Engelmann, but to me. He caught me by the arm as I was leaving the room in my turn. "Poison," the doctor whispered in my ear. "Keep it a secret. That's what he means." I ran to my own bedchamber and bolted myself in. At that one word, "poison," the atrocious suggestion of Frau Meyer, when she had referred to Dr. Fontaine's lost medicine chest, instantly associated itself in my memory with Madame Fontaine's suspicious intrusion into Mr. Keller's room. Good God! Had I not surprised her standing close by the table on which the night drink was set? And had I not heard Dr. Dormann say, "That's unlucky," when he was told that the barley water had been all drunk by the patient, and the jug and glass washed as usual? For the first few moments I really think I must have been beside myself, so completely was I overpowered by the horror of my own suspicions. I had just sense enough to keep out of Mr. Engelmann's way until I felt my mind restored in some degree to its customary balance. Recovering the power of thinking connectedly, I began to feel ashamed of the panic which had seized on me. What conceivable object had the widow to gain by Mr. Keller's death? Her whole interest in her daughter's future centered, on the contrary, in his living long enough to be made ashamed of his prejudices, and to give his consent to the marriage. To kill him for the purpose of removing Fritz from the influence of his father's authority would be so atrocious an act in itself, and would so certainly separate Minna and Fritz forever, in the perfectly possible event of a discovery, that I really recoiled from the contemplation of this contingency as I might have recoiled from deliberately disgracing myself. Doctor Dormann had rashly rushed at a false conclusion. That was the one comforting reflection that occurred to me. I threw open my door again, in a frenzy of impatience to hear the decision, whichever way it might turn. The experiment had been tried in my absence. Mr. Keller had fallen into a broken slumber. Doctor Dormann was just closing the little bag in which he had brought his testing apparatus from his own house. Even now there was no prevailing on him to state his suspicions plainly. "It's curious," he said, "to see how all mortal speculations on events generally resolve themselves into threes. Have we given the emetic too late? Are my tests insufficient? Or have I made a complete mistake?" He turned to his elder colleague. "My dear doctor, I see you want a positive answer. No need to leave the room, Mr. Engelmann. You and the young English gentleman, your friend, must not be deceived for a single moment, so far as I am concerned. I see in the patient a mysterious wasting of the vital powers, which is not accompanied by the symptoms of any disease known to me, to which I can point as a cause. In plain words, I tell you, I don't understand Mr. Keller's illness." It was perhaps through a motive of delicacy that he persisted in making a needless mystery of his suspicions. In any case, he was evidently a man who despised all quackery from the bottom of his heart. The old doctor looked at him with a frown of disapproval, as if his frank confession had violated the unwritten laws of medical etiquette. "If you will allow me to watch the case," he resumed, "under the superintendence of my respected colleague, I shall be happy to submit to approval any palliative treatment which may occur to me. My respected colleague knows that I am always ready to learn." His respected colleague made a formal bow, looked at his watch, and hastened away to another patient. Doctor Dormann, taking up his hat, stopped to look at Mother Barbara fast asleep in her easy chair by the bedside. "I must find you a competent nurse to-morrow," he said. "No, not one of the hospital women. We want some one with finer feelings and tenderer hands than theirs. In the meantime, one of you must sit up with Mr. Keller to-night. If I am not wanted before, I will be with you to-morrow morning." I volunteered to keep watch, promising to call Mr. Engelmann if any alarming symptoms showed themselves. The old housekeeper, waking after her first sleep, characteristically insisted on sending me to bed and taking my place. I was too anxious and uneasy, if I may say it of myself, to be as compliant as usual. Mother Barbara, for once, found that she had a resolute person to deal with. At a less distressing time, there would have been something irresistibly comical in her rage and astonishment when I settled the dispute by locking her out of the room. Soon afterwards Joseph came in with a message. If there was no immediate necessity for his presence in the bedchamber, Mr. Engelmann would go out to get a breath of fresh air before he retired for the night. There was no necessity for his presence, and I sent a message downstairs to that effect. An hour later Mr. Engelmann came in to see his old friend, and to say good night. After an interval of restlessness, the sufferer had become composed, and was dozing again under the influence of his medicine. Making all allowances for the sorrow and anxiety which Mr. Engelmann must necessarily feel under the circumstances, I thought his manner strangely absent and confused. He looked like a man with some burden on his mind, which he was afraid to reveal and unable to throw off. "Somebody must be found, David, who does understand the case," he said, looking at the helpless figure on the bed. "Who can we find?" I asked. He bade me good night without answering. It is no exaggeration to say that I passed my night at the bedside in a miserable state of indecision and suspense. The doctor's experiment had failed to prove absolutely that the doctor's doubts were without foundation. In this state of things, was it my bounden duty to tell the medical men what I had seen, when I went back to the house to look for Mr. Keller's opera glass? The more I thought of it, the more I recoiled from the idea of throwing a frightful suspicion on Minna's mother, which would overshadow an innocent woman for the rest of her life. What proof had I that she had lied to me about the sketch and the mantelpiece? And without proof, how could how dare I, open my lips? I succeeded in deciding firmly enough for the alternative of silence during the intervals when my attendance on the sick man was not required. But when he wanted his medicine, when his pillows needed a little arrangement, when I saw his poor eyes open and look at me vacantly, then my resolution failed me, my indecision returned, the horrid necessity of speaking showed itself again, and shook me to the soul. Never in the trials of later life have I passed such a night as that night at Mr. Keller's bedside. When the light of the new day shone in at the window, it was but too plainly visible that the symptoms had altered for the worse. The apathy was more profound, the wan pinched look of the face had increased, the intervals between the attacks of nervous trembling had grown shorter and shorter. Come what might of it, when Doctor Dormann paid his promised visit, I felt I was now bound to inform him that another person besides the servants and ourselves had obtained access secretly to Mr. Keller's room. I was so completely worn out by agitation and want of sleep, and I showed it, I suppose, so plainly, that good Mr. Engelmann insisted on my leaving him in charge, and retiring to rest. I laid down on my bed, with the door of my room ajar, resolved to listen for the doctor's footsteps on the stairs, and to speak to him privately after he had seen the patient. If I had been 20 years older, I might have succeeded in carrying out my intention, but with the young, sleep is a paramount necessity, and nature insists on obedience to its merciful law. I remember feeling drowsy, starting up from the bed and walking about my room to keep myself awake, then lying down again from sheer fatigue, and after that, total oblivion. When I woke and looked at my watch, I found that I had been fast asleep for no less than 6 hours. Bewildered and ashamed of myself, afraid to think of what might have happened in that long interval, I hurried to Mr. Keller's room and softly knocked on the door. A woman's voice answered me. "Come in." I paused with my hand on the door. The voice was familiar to me. I had a moment's doubt whether I was mad or dreaming. The voice softly repeated, "Come in." I entered the room. There she was, seated at the bedside, smiling quietly and lifting her finger to her lips. As certainly as I saw the familiar objects in the room and the prostrate figure on the bed, I saw Madame Fontaine. "Speak low," she said. "He sleeps very lightly. He must not be disturbed." I approached the bed and looked at him. There was a faint tinge of color in his face. There was moisture on his forehead. His hands lay as still on the counterpane, in the blessed repose that possessed him, as the hands of a sleeping child. I looked round at Madame Fontaine. She smiled again. My utter bewilderment seemed to amuse her. "He is left entirely to me, David," she said, looking tenderly at her patient. "Go downstairs and see Mr. Engelmann. There must be no talking here." She lightly wiped the perspiration from his forehead, lightly laid her fingers on his pulse, then reclined in the easy chair, with her eyes fixed in silent interest on the sleeping man. She was the very ideal of the nurse with fine feelings and tender hands, contemplated by Doctor Dormann when I had last seen him. Any stranger looking into the room at that moment would have said, "What a charming picture! What a devoted wife!" End of Chapter 18 of Part 1. Part 1, Chapter 19 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 19. A tumbler of the old Marco Brunner, David, and a slice of the game pie before I say one word about what we owe to that angel upstairs. Off with the wine, my dear boy. You look as pale as death." With those words Mr. Engelmann lit his pipe, and waited in silence until the good eating and drinking had done their good work. "Now carry your mind back to last night," he began. "You remember my going out to get a breath of fresh air. Can you guess what that meant?" I guessed, of course, that it meant a visit to Madame Fontaine. "Quite right, David. I promised to call on her earlier in the day, but poor Keller's illness made that impossible. She wrote to me under the impression that something serious might have happened to prevent me, for the first time, from keeping an appointment that I had made with her. When I left you, I went to answer her note personally. She was not only distressed to hear of Mr. Keller's illness, she was interested enough in my sad news to ask particularly in what form the illness declared itself. When I mentioned what the symptoms were, she showed an agitation which took me quite by surprise. 'Do the doctors understand what is the matter with him?' she asked. I told her that one of the doctors was evidently puzzled, and that the other had acknowledged that the malady was so far incomprehensible to him. She clasped her hands in despair. She said, 'Oh, if my poor husband had been alive!' I naturally asked what she meant. I wish I could give her explanation, David, in her own delightful words. It came in substance to this: some person in her husband's employment at the University of Würzburg had been attacked by a malady presenting exactly the same symptoms from which Mr. Keller was suffering. The medical men had been just as much at a loss what to do as our medical men. Alone among them, Dr. Fontaine understood the case. He made up the medicine that he administered with his own hand. Madame Fontaine, under her husband's instructions, assisted in nursing the sick man, and in giving the nourishment prescribed when he was able to eat. His extraordinary recovery is remembered in the University to this day." I interrupted Mr. Engelmann at that point. "Of course you ask her for the prescription," I said. "I begin to understand it now." "No, David, you don't understand it yet. I certainly asked her for the prescription. No such thing was known to be in existence. She reminded me that her husband had made up the medicine himself. But she remembered that the results had exceeded his anticipations, and that only a part of the remedy had been used. The bottle might still perhaps be found at Würzburg, or it might be in a small portmanteau belonging to her husband, which she had found in his bedroom, and had brought away with her to be examined at some future time. "I have not had the heart to open it yet," she said, "but for Mr. Keller's sake I will look it over before you go away. There is a Christian woman, David, if ever there was one yet. After the manner in which poor Keller had treated her, she was as eager to help him as if he had been her dearest friend. Minna offered to take her place. 'Why should you distress yourself, mamma?' she said. 'Tell me what the bottle is like, and let me try if I can find it.' No, it was quite enough for Madame Fontaine that there was an act of mercy to be done. At any sacrifice of her own feelings, she was prepared to do it." I interrupted him again, eager to hear the end. "And she found the bottle?" I said. "She found the bottle," Mr. Engelmann resumed. "I can show it to you if you like. She has herself requested me to keep it under lock and key so long as it is wanted in this house." He opened an old cabinet, and took out a long narrow bottle of dark blue glass. In form it was quaintly and remarkably unlike any modern bottle that I had ever seen. The glass stopper was carefully secured by a piece of leather, for the better preservation, I suppose, of the liquid inside. Down one side of the bottle ran a narrow strip of paper, notched at regular intervals, to indicate the dose that was to be given. No label appeared on it, but examining the surface of the glass carefully, I found certain faintly marked stains, which suggested that the label might have been removed, and that some traces of the paste or gum by which it had been secured had not been completely washed away. I held the bottle up to the light, and found that it was still nearly half full. Mr. Engelmann forbade me to remove the stopper. It was very important, he said, that no air should be admitted to the bottle, except when there was an actual necessity for administering the remedy. "I took it away with me the same night," he went on, "and a wretched state of mind I was in, between my anxiety to give the medicine to poor dear Keller immediately, and my fear of taking such a serious responsibility entirely on myself. Madame Fontaine, always just in her views, said, 'You had better wait and consult the doctors.' She made but one condition, the generous creature, relating to herself. 'If the remedy is tried,' she said, 'I must ask you to give it a fair chance by permitting me to act as nurse. The treatment of the patient when he begins to feel the benefit of the medicine is of serious importance. I know this from my husband's instructions, and it is due to his memory, to say nothing of what is due to Mr. Keller, that I should be at the bedside.' It is needless to say that I joyfully accepted the offered help. So the night passed. The next morning, soon after you fell asleep, the doctors came. You may imagine what they thought of poor Keller, when I tell you that they recommended me to write instantly to Fritz in London, summoning him to his father's bedside. I was just in time to catch the special mail which left this morning. Don't blame me, David. I could not feel absolutely sure of the new medicine, and with time of such terrible importance, and London so far off, I was really afraid to miss a post." I was far from blaming him, and I said so. In his place I should have done what he did. We arranged that I should write to Fritz by that night's mail, on the chance that my announcement of the better news might reach him before he left London. "My letter dispatched," Mr. Engelmann continued, I begged both the doctors to speak with me before they went away, in my private room. There I told them, in the plainest words I could find, exactly what I have told you. Dr. Dormann behaved like a gentleman. He said, 'Let me see the lady, and speak to her myself before the new remedy is tried.' As for the other, what do you think he did? Walked out of the house, the old brute, and declined any further attendance on the patient. And who do you think followed him out of the house, David, when I sent for Madame Fontaine? Another old brute, Mother Barbara." After what I had seen myself of the housekeeper's temper on the previous evening, this last piece of news failed to surprise me. To be stripped of her authority as nurse in favor of a stranger, and that stranger a handsome lady, was an aggravation of the wrong which Mother Barbara had contemplated when she threatened us with the alternative of leaving the house. "Well," Mr. Engelmann resumed, "Doctor Dormann asked his questions, and smelt and tasted the medicine, and, with Madame Fontaine's full approval, took away a little of it to be analyzed. That came to nothing. The medicine kept its own secret. All the ingredients but two set analysis at defiance. In the meantime, we gave the first dose. Half an hour since, we tried the second. You have seen the result with your own eyes. She has saved his life, David, and we have you to thank for it. But for you, we might never have known Madame Fontaine." The door opened as he spoke, and I found myself confronted by a second surprise. Minna came in, wearing a cook's apron, and asked if her mother had rung for her yet. Under the widow's instructions, she was preparing the peculiar vegetable diet which had been prescribed by Dr. Fontaine as part of the cure. The good girl was eager to make herself useful to us in any domestic capacity. What a charming substitute for the crabbed old housekeeper who had just left us! So here were Madame Fontaine and Minna actually established as inmates under the same roof with Mr. Keller. What would Fritz think when he knew of it? What would Mr. Keller say when he recognized his nurse, and when he heard that she had saved his life? "All's well that ends well," is a good proverb. But we had not got as far as that yet. The question in our case was, how will it end? End of chapter 19 of part 1. Part 1, Chapter 20 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 20. When late that night I entered my bedroom again, how I blessed the lucky accident of my 6 hours' sleep after a night's watching at Mr. Keller's bedside! If I had spoken to Doctor Dormann as I had positively resolved to speak, he would, beyond all doubt, have forbidden the employment of Madame Fontaine's remedy. Mr. Keller would have died, and the innocent woman who had saved his life would have been suspected, perhaps even tried, on a charge of murdering him. I really trembled when I looked back on the terrible consequences which must have followed if I had succeeded that morning in keeping myself awake. The next day the doses of the wonderful medicine were renewed at the regular intervals, and the prescribed vegetable diet was carefully administered. On the day after, the patient was so far advanced on the way to recovery that the stopper of the dark blue bottle was permanently secured again under its leather guard. Mr. Engelmann told me that nearly 2 doses of it were still left at the bottom. He also mentioned, on my asking to look at it again, that the widow had relieved him of the care of the bottle, and had carefully locked it up in her own room. Late on this day also, the patient being well enough to leave his bed and to occupy the armchair in his room, the inevitable disclosure took place, and Madame Fontaine stood revealed in the character of the Good Samaritan who had saved Mr. Keller's life. By Doctor Dormann's advice, those persons only were permitted to enter the bedroom whose presence was absolutely necessary. Besides Madame Fontaine and the doctor himself, Mr. Engelmann and Minna were the other witnesses of the scene. Mr. Engelmann had his claim to be present as an old friend, and Minna was to be made useful at her mother's suggestion as a means of gently preparing Mr. Keller's mind for the revelation that was to come. Under these circumstances, I can only describe what took place by repeating the little narrative with which Minna favored me, after she had left the room. "We arranged that I should wait downstairs," she said, "until I heard the bedroom bell ring, and then I myself was to take up Mr. Keller's dinner of lentils and cream, and put it on his table without saying a word." "Exactly like a servant!" I exclaimed. Gentle, sweet-tempered Minna answered my foolish interruption with her customary simplicity and good sense. "Why not?" she asked. "Fritz's father may one day be my father, and I am happy to be of the smallest use to him, whenever he wants me. Well, when I went in, I found him in his chair, with the light let into the room, and with plenty of pillows to support him. Mr. Engelmann and the doctor were on either side of him, and poor dear mamma was standing back in a corner behind the bed, where he could not see her. He looked up at me when I came in with my tray. 'Who's this?' he asked of Mr. Engelmann. 'Is she a new servant?' Mr. Engelmann, humoring him, answered, 'Yes, a nice looking girl,' he said. 'But what does Mother Barbara say to her?' Upon this, Mr. Engelmann told him how the housekeeper had left her place, and why. As soon as he had recovered his surprise, he looked at me again. 'But who has been my nurse?' he inquired. 'Surely not this young girl?' 'No, no, the young girl's mother has nursed you,' said Mr. Engelmann. He looked at the doctor as he spoke, and the doctor interfered for the first time. 'She has not only nursed you, sir,' he said. 'I can certify medically that she has saved your life. Don't excite yourself. You shall hear exactly how it happened.' In 2 minutes he told the whole story so clearly and beautifully that it was quite a pleasure to hear him. One thing only he concealed, the name. 'Who is she?' Mr. Keller cried out. 'Why am I not allowed to express my gratitude? Why isn't she here?' 'She is afraid to approach you, sir,' said the doctor. 'You have a very bad opinion of her.' 'A bad opinion?' Mr. Keller repeated. 'Of a woman I don't know? Who is the slanderer who has said that of me?' The doctor signed to Mr. Engelmann to answer. 'Speak plainly,' he whispered behind the chair. Mr. Engelmann did speak plainly. 'Pardon me, my dear Keller. There is no slanderer in this matter. Your own action has spoken for you. A short time since, try if you cannot remember it yourself, a lady sent a letter to you, and you sent the letter back to her, refusing to read it. Do you know how she has returned the insult? That noble creature is the woman to whom you owe your life.' When he said those words, the doctor crossed the room and returned again to Mr. Keller, leading my mother by the hand. Minna's voice faltered. She stopped at the most interesting part of her narrative. 'What did Mr. Keller say?' I asked. 'There was silence in the room,' Minna answered softly. I heard nothing except the ticking of the clock." "But you must have seen something." "No, David, I couldn't help it. I was crying. After a while, my mother put her arm round me and led me to Mr. Keller. I dried my eyes as well as I could, and saw him again. His head was bent down on his breast. His hands hung helpless over the arms of the chair. It was dreadful to see him so overwhelmed by shame and sorrow. 'What can I do?' he groaned to himself. 'God help me, what can I do?' Mamma spoke to him so sweetly and so prettily. 'You can give this poor girl of mine a kiss, sir. The new servant who has waited on you is my daughter Minna.' He looked up quickly and drew me to him. 'I can make but one atonement, my dear,' he said, and then he kissed me and whispered, 'Send for Fritz.' Oh, don't ask me to tell you any more, David. I shall only begin crying again, and I am so happy." She left me to write to Fritz by that night's post. I tried vainly to induce her to wait a little. We had no electric telegraphs at our disposal, and we were reduced to guessing at events. But there was certainly a strong probability that Fritz might have left London immediately on the receipt of Mr. Engelmann's letter, announcing that his father was dangerously ill. In this case, my letter, dispatched by the next mail to relieve his anxiety, would be left unopened in London, and Fritz might be expected to arrive, if he travelled without stopping, in the course of the next day or two. I put this reasonable view of the matter to Minna, and received a thoroughly irrational and womanly reply. "I don't care, David. I shall write to him for all that." "Why?" "Because I like writing to him." "What? Whether he receives your letter or not?" "Whether he receives it or not," she answered saucily, "I shall have the pleasure of writing to him. That is all I want." She covered 4 pages of note paper, and insisted on posting them herself. The next morning Mr. Keller was able, with my help and Mr. Engelmann's, to get downstairs to the sitting room. We were both with him when Madame Fontaine came in. "Well?" he asked. "Have you brought it with you?" She handed him a sealed envelope, and then turned to explain herself to me. "The letter that you put on Mr. Keller's desk," she said pleasantly. "This time, David, I act as my own postman, at Mr. Keller's request." In her place, I should certainly have torn it up. To keep it, on the bare chance of it proving to be of some use in the future, seemed to imply either an excessive hopefulness or an extraordinary foresight on the widow's part. Without in the least comprehending my own state of mind, I felt that she had, in some mysterious way, disappointed me by keeping that letter. As a matter of course, I turned to leave the room, and Mr. Engelmann, from a similar motive of delicacy, followed me to the door. Mr. Keller called us both back. "Wait, if you please," he said, "until I have read it." Madame Fontaine was looking out of the window. It was impossible for us to discover whether she approved of our remaining in the room or not. Mr. Keller read the closely written pages with the steadiest attention. He signed to the widow to approach him, and took her hand when he had arrived at the last words. "Let me ask your pardon," he said, "in the presence of my partner, and in the presence of David Glenney, who took charge of your letter. Madame Fontaine, I speak the plain truth, in the plainest words, when I tell you that I am ashamed of myself." She dropped on her knees before him, and entreated him to say no more. Mr. Engelmann looked at her, absorbed in admiration. Perhaps it was the fault of my English education. I thought the widow's humility a little overdone. What Mr. Keller's opinion might be, he kept to himself. He merely insisted on her rising and taking a chair by his side. "To say that I believe every word of your letter," he resumed, "is only to do you the justice which I have too long delayed. But there is one passage which I must feel satisfied that I thoroughly understand, if you will be pleased to give me the assurance of it with your own lips. Am I right in concluding, from what is here written of your husband's creditors, that his debts, which have now in honor become your debts, have been all actually paid to the last farthing?" "To the last farthing," Madame Fontaine answered, without a moment's hesitation. "I can show you the receipt, sir, if you like." "No, madam, I take your word for it. I require nothing more. Your title to my heartfelt respect is now complete. The slanders which I have disgraced myself by believing would never have found their way to my credulity if they had not first declared you to have ruined your husband by your debts. I own that I have never been able to divest myself of my inbred dislike and distrust of people who contract debts which they are not able to pay. The light manner in which the world is apt to view the relative positions of debtor and creditor is abhorrent to me. If I promise to pay a man money, and fail to keep my promise, I am no better than a liar and a cheat. That always has been, and always will be, my view." He took her hand again as he made that strong declaration. "There is another bond of sympathy between us," he said warmly. "You think as I do." Good heavens! If Frau Meyer had told me the truth, what would happen when Madame Fontaine discovered that her promissory note was in the hands of a stranger, a man who would inexorably present it for payment on the day when it fell due? I tried to persuade myself that Frau Meyer had not told me the truth. Perhaps I might have succeeded, but for my remembrance of the disreputable looking stranger on the doorstep, who had been so curious to know if Madame Fontaine intended to leave her lodgings. Chapter 20 Part 1.
Part 1, Chapter 21 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Kurt-Boulet. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 21. The next day, my calculation of possibilities in the matter of Fritz turned out to be correct. Returning to Main Street, after a short absence from the house, the door was precipitately opened to me by Minna. Before she could say a word, her face told me the joyful news. Before I could congratulate her, Fritz himself burst headlong into the hall, and made one of his desperate attempts at embracing me. This time I succeeded, being the shorter man of the two, in slipping through his arms in the nick of time. "Do you want to kiss me," I exclaimed, "when Minna is in the house?" "I have been kissing Minna," Fritz answered with perfect gravity, "until we are both of us out of breath. I look upon you as a sort of safety valve." At this, Minna's charming face became eloquent in another way. I only waited to ask for news of my aunt before I withdrew. Mrs. Wagner was already on the road to Frankfurt, following Fritz by easy stages. "And where is Jack Straw?" I inquired. "Traveling with her," said Fritz. Having received this last extraordinary piece of intelligence, I put off all explanations until a fitter opportunity, and left the lovers together until dinner time. It was one of the last fine days of the autumn. The sunshine tempted me to take a turn in Mr. Engelmann's garden. A shrubbery of evergreens divided the lawn near the house from the flower beds which occupied the further extremity of the plot of ground. While I was on one side of the shrubbery, I heard the voices of Mr. Keller and Madame Fontaine on the other side. Then, and then only, I remembered that the doctor had suggested a little walking exercise for the invalid, while the sun was at its warmest in the first hours of the afternoon. Madame Fontaine was in attendance, in the absence of Mr. Engelmann, engaged in the duties of the office. I had just turned back again towards the house, thinking it better not to disturb them, when I heard my name on the widow's lips. Better men than I, under stress of temptation, have been known to commit actions unworthy of them. I was mean enough to listen, and I paid the proverbial penalty for gratifying my curiosity. I heard no good of myself. "You have honored me by asking my advice, sir," I heard Madame Fontaine say. "With regard to young David Glenney, I can speak quite impartially. In a few days more, if I can be of no further use to you, I shall have left the house." Mr. Keller interrupted her there. "Pardon me, Madame Fontaine, I can't let you talk of leaving us. We are without a housekeeper, as you know. You will confer a favor on me and on Mr. Engelmann, if you will kindly undertake the direction of our domestic affairs, for the present at least. Besides, your charming daughter is the light of our household. What will Fritz say if you take her away just when he has come home? No, no, you and Minna must stay with us." "You are only too good to me, sir. Perhaps I had better ascertain what Mr. Engelmann's wishes are before we decide?" Mr. Keller laughed, and, more extraordinary still, Mr. Keller made a little joke. "My dear madam, if you don't know what Mr. Engelmann's wishes are likely to be, without asking him, you are the most unobservant lady that ever lived. Speak to him, by all means, if you think it formally necessary, and let us return to the question of taking David Glenney into our office here. A letter which he has lately received from Mrs. Wagner expresses no intention of recalling him to London, and he has managed so cleverly in a business matter which I confided to him, that he would really be an acquisition to us. Besides, until the marriage takes place, he would be a companion for Fritz." "That is exactly why I feel a difficulty," Madame Fontaine replied. "To my mind, sir, Mr. David is not at all a desirable companion for your son. The admirable candor and simplicity of Fritz's disposition might suffer by association with a person of Mr. David's very peculiar character. May I ask, Madame Fontaine, in what you think his character peculiar?" "I will endeavor to express what I feel, sir. You have spoken of his cleverness. I venture to say that he is too clever, and I have observed that he is, for a young man, far too easily moved to suspect others. Do I make myself understood?" "Perfectly. Pray go on." "I find, Mr. Keller, that there is something of the Jesuit about our young friend. He has a way of refining on trifles, and seeing under the surface, where nothing is to be seen. Don't attach too much importance to what I say. It is quite likely that I am influenced by the popular prejudice against old heads on young shoulders. At the same time, I confess I wouldn't keep him here if I were in your place. Shall we move a little further on?" Madame Fontaine was, I dare say, perfectly right in her estimate of me. Looking back at the pages of this narrative, I discover some places in which I certainly appear to justify her opinion. I even justified it at the time. Before she and Mr. Keller were out of my hearing, I began to see under the surface, and to refine on what she had said. Was it Jesuitical to doubt the disinterestedness of her advice? I did doubt it. Was it Jesuitical to suspect that she privately distrusted me, and had reasons of her own for keeping me out of her way, at the safe distance of London? I did suspect it. And yet she was such a good Christian, and yet she had so nobly and so undeniably saved Mr. Keller's life. What right had I to impute self-seeking motives to such a woman as this? Mean, mean! There was no excuse for me. I turned back to the house, with my head feeling very old on my young shoulders. Madame Fontaine's manner to me was so charming, when we all met at the dinner table, that I fell into a condition of remorseful silence. Fortunately, Fritz took most of the talking on himself, and the general attention was diverted from me. His high spirits, his boisterous nonsense, his contempt for all lawful forms and ceremonies, which placed impediments in the way of his speedy marriage, were amusingly contrasted by Mr. Engelmann's courteous simplicity in trying to argue the question seriously with his reckless young friend. "Don't talk to me about the customary delays, and the parson's duty," cried Fritz. "Tell me this, does he do his duty without being paid for it?" "We must all live," pleaded good Mr. Engelmann. "The parson must pay the butcher and the baker, like the rest of us." "That's shirking the question, my dear sir. Will the parson marry Minna and me without being paid for it?" In all civilized countries, Fritz, there are fees for the performance of the marriage ceremony. Very well. Now follow my train of reasoning, Mr. Engelmann. On your own showing, the whole affair is a matter of money. The parson gets his fee for making Minna my wife, after the customary delays." There Minna modestly interposed. "Why do you object to the customary delays, dear Fritz?" "I'll tell you, my angel, when we are married. In the meantime I resume my train of reasoning, and I entreat Mr. Engelmann not to forget that this is a matter of money. Make it worth the parson's while to marry us without the customary delays. Double his fee, treble his fee, give him 10 times his fee. It's merely a question of what his reverence can resist. My father is a rich man. Favor me with a blank check, papa, and I will make Minna Mrs. Keller before the end of the week." The father, hitherto content to listen and be amused, checked the son's flow of nonsense at this point. "There is a time for everything, Fritz," he said. "We have had laughing enough. When you talk of your marriage, I am sorry to observe that you entirely pass over the consideration which is due to your father's only surviving relative." Madame Fontaine laid down her knife and fork as if her dinner had come to an end. The sudden appearance in the conversation of the surviving relative had evidently taken her by surprise. Mr. Keller, observing her, turned away from his son, and addressed himself exclusively to the widow when he spoke next. "I referred, Madame Fontaine, to my elder sister," he said. "She and I are the sole survivors of a large family." "Does the lady live in this city, sir?" the widow inquired. "No, she still lives in our birthplace, Munich." "May I ask another question?" "As many questions, dear madam, as you like." "Is your sister married?" "My sister has never been married." "Not for want of suitors," said courteous Mr. Engelmann. "A most majestic person, witty and accomplished, possessed of an enviable little fortune, entirely at her own disposal." Mr. Keller gently reproved this latter allusion to the question of money. "My good friend, Madame Fontaine has a mind above all mercenary considerations. My sister's place in her esteem and regard will not be influenced by my sister's fortune when they meet, as I hope they will meet, at Fritz's marriage." At this, Fritz burst into the conversation in his usual headlong way. "Oh, dear me, papa, have some consideration for us. If we wait for my aunt, we shall never be married on this side of eternity." "Fritz?" "Don't be angry, sir, I meant no harm. I was thinking of my aunt's asthma. At her age, she will never take the long journey from Munich to Frankfurt. Permit me to offer a suggestion. Let us be married first, and then pay her a visit in the honeymoon." Mr. Keller passed his son's suggestion over without notice, and addressed himself once more to Madame Fontaine. "I propose writing to my sister in a day or two," he resumed, "to inform her of the contemplated marriage. She already knows your name through Mr. Engelmann, who kindly wrote to allay her anxiety about my illness. And to tell her," Mr. Engelmann interposed, "to whose devotion he owes his recovery." The widow received this tribute with eyes fixed modestly on her plate. Her black dress, rising and falling over her bosom, betrayed an agitation which her enemies at Würzburg might have attributed to the discovery of the rich sister at Munich. Mr. Keller went on. "I am sure I may trust to your womanly sympathies to understand the affection which binds me to my last living relative. My sister's presence at the marriage will be an inexpressible comfort and happiness to me. In spite of what my son has said, you are sadly given to talking at random, Fritz. I believe she will not shrink from the journey to Frankfurt, if we only make it easier to her by consulting her health and convenience. Our young people have all their lives before them. Our young people can wait." "Certainly, sir." She gave that short answer very quietly, with her eyes still on her plate. It was impossible to discover in what frame of mind she viewed the prospect of delay involved in Mr. Keller's consideration for his sister. For the moment, Fritz was simply confounded. He looked at Minna, recovered himself, and favored his father with another suggestion. "I have got it now!" he exclaimed. "Why not spare my aunt the fatigue of the journey? Let us all start for Bavaria tomorrow, and have the marriage at Munich." "And leave the business at Frankfurt to take care of itself at the busiest time of the year?" his father added ironically. "When you open your mouth again, Fritz, put food and drink into it. and confine yourself to that." With those words the question of the marriage was closed for the time. When dinner was over, Mr. Keller retired to take some rest in his own room. Fritz and his sweetheart left the house together, on an errand in which they were both equally interested, the purchase of the ring which was to typify Minna's engagement. Left alone with Mr. Engelmann and the widow, I felt that I might be an obstacle to confidential conversation, and withdrew to the office. Though not regularly employed as one of the clerks, I had been admitted to serve as a volunteer since my return from Hanau. In this way I improved my experience of the details of our business, and I made some small return for the hospitable welcome which I had received from the two partners. Half an hour or more had passed, when some papers arrived from the bank, which required the signature of the firm. Mr. Engelmann being still absent, the head clerk, at my suggestion, proceeded to the dining-room with the papers in his charge. He came back again immediately, looking very much alarmed. "Pray go into the dining-room," he said to me. "I am afraid something is seriously wrong with Mr. Engelmann." "Do you mean that he is ill?" I asked. "I can hardly say. His arms are stretched out on the table, and his face is hidden on them. He paid no attention to me. I am almost afraid he was crying." Crying? I had left him in excellent spirits, casting glances of the tenderest admiration at Madame Fontaine. Without waiting to hear more, I ran to the dining-room. He was alone, in the position described by the clerk, and, poor old man, he was indeed weeping bitterly. I put my hand with all possible gentleness on his shoulder, and said, with the tenderness that I really felt for him, "Dear Mr. Engelmann, what has happened to distress you?" At the sound of my voice he looked up, and caught me fervently by the hand. "Stay here with me a little while, David," he said. "I have got my death blow." I sat down by him directly. "Try and tell me what has happened," I went on. "I left you here with Madame Fontaine." His tears suddenly ceased. His hand closed convulsively on mine. "Don't speak of her!" he cried, with an outburst of anger. "You were right about her, David. She is a false woman." As the words passed his lips, he changed again. His voice faltered. He seemed to be frightened by his own violent language. "Oh, what am I talking about? What right have I to say that of her? I am a brute. I am reviling the best of women. It was all my fault, David. I have acted like a madman, like a fool. Oh, my boy, would you believe it? I asked her to marry me." It is needless to say that I wanted no further explanation. "Did she encourage you to ask her?" I inquired. "I thought she did, David. I thought I would be clever and seize the opportunity. She said she wanted to consult me. She said, 'Mr. Keller has asked me to stay here and keep house for you. I have not given my answer yet. I have waited to know if you approved it.' Upon that, I said the rash words. I asked her to be more than our housekeeper, to be my wife." "I am naturally stupid," said the poor simple gentleman. "Whenever I try to do anything clever, I always fail. She was very forbearing with me at first. She said no, but she said it considerately, as if she felt for me. I presumed on her kindness like a fool. I couldn't help it, David, I was so fond of her. I pressed her to say why she refused me. I was mad enough to ask if there was some other man whom she preferred. Oh, she said some hard things to me in her anger. And worse still, when I went down on my knees to her, she said, 'Get up, you old fool,' and laughed, and left me. Take me away somewhere, David. I am too old to get over it if I stay here. I can never see her or speak to her again. Take me to England with you. And, oh, don't tell Keller." He burst into another fit of tears. It was dreadful to see and hear him. I tried to think of some consoling words. Before I could give expression to my thought, the door of the room was gently opened, and Madame Fontaine herself stood before us. Her eyes looked at Mr. Engelmann from under their heavy lids, with a quiet and scornful compassion. The poor wretch was of no further use to her. Quite needless to be on her best behavior with him now. "There is not the least occasion, sir, to disturb yourself," she said. "It is my duty to leave the house, and I will do it." Without waiting to be answered, she turned back to the door, and left us. End of chapter 21 of part 1. Chapter 22 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 22. For heaven's sake, sir, allow me to go. On no account, Madame Fontaine. If you won't remain here, in justice to yourself, remain as a favor to me. When I opened my bedroom door the next morning, the widow and Mr. Keller were on the landing outside, and those were the words exchanged between them. Mr. Keller approached and spoke to me. "What do you know, David, about the disappearance of Mr. Engelmann?" "Disappearance?" I repeated. "I was with him yesterday evening, and I bade him good night in his own room." "He must have left the house before the servants were up this morning," said Mr. Keller. "Read that." He handed me a morsel of paper with writing on it in pencil. "Forgive me, dear friend and partner, for leaving you without saying good-bye; also for burdening you with the direction of business, before you are perhaps strong enough to accept the charge. My mind is in such a state of confusion that I should be worse than useless in the office. While I write this, my poor weak head burns as if there was fire in it. I cannot face her, I cannot face you. I must go before I lose all control over myself. Don't attempt to trace me. If change and absence restore me to myself, I will return. If not, a man at my age and in my state of mind is willing to die. Please tell Madame Fontaine that I ask her pardon with all my heart. Good-bye, and God bless and prosper you." I was unaffectedly distressed. There was something terrible in this sudden break-up of poor Engelmann's harmless life, something cruel and shocking in the passion of love fixing its relentless hold on an innocent old man, fast nearing the end of his days. There are hundreds of examples of this deplorable anomaly in real life. And yet, when we meet with it in our own experience, we are always taken by surprise, and always ready to express doubt or derision when we hear of it in the experience of others. Madame Fontaine behaved admirably. She sat down on the window seat at the end of the landing, and wrung her hands with a gesture of despair. "Oh," she said, "if he had asked me for anything else! If I could have made any other sacrifice to him! God knows I never dreamed of it. I never gave him the smallest encouragement. We might have all been so happy together here. And I, who would have gone to the world's end to serve Mr. Keller and Mr. Engelmann, I am the unhappy creature who has broken up the household." Mr. Keller was deeply affected. He sat down on the window seat by Madame Fontaine. "My dear, dear lady," he said, "you are entirely blameless in this matter. Even my unfortunate partner feels it, and asks your pardon. If inquiries can discover him, they shall be set on foot immediately. In the meantime, let me entreat you to compose yourself. Engelmann has perhaps done wisely to leave us for a time. He will get over his delusion, and all may be well yet." I went downstairs, not caring to hear more. All my sympathies, I confess, were with Mr. Engelmann, though he was a fat simple old man. Mr. Keller seemed to me (here is more of the old head on young shoulders) to have gone from one extreme to the other. He had begun by treating the widow with unbecoming injustice, and he was now flattering her with unreasonable partiality. For the next few days there was tranquillity, if not happiness, in the house. Mr. Keller wrote to his sister in Munich, inviting her to mention the earliest date at which it might suit her convenience to be present at the marriage of his son. Madame Fontaine assumed the regular management of her domestic affairs. Fritz and Minna found sufficient attraction in each other's society. The new week was just beginning, and our enquiries after Mr. Engelmann had thus far led to no result, when I received a letter containing news of the fugitive, confided to me under strict reserve. The writer of the letter proved to be a married younger brother of Mr. Engelmann, residing at Bingen on the Rhine. I write to you, dear sir, at my brother's request. My wife and I are doing all that we can to relieve and comfort him, but his mind has not yet sufficiently recovered to enable him to write to you himself. He desires to thank you heartily for your sympathy at the most trying period of his life, and he trusts to your kindness to let him hear, from time to time, of Mr. Keller's progress towards recovery, and of the well-being of the business. In addressing your letters to me at Bingen, you will be pleased to consider the information of my brother's whereabouts herein afforded to you as strictly confidential, until you hear from me to the contrary. In his present frame of mind, it would be in the last degree painful to him to be made the subject of inquiries, remonstrances, or entreaties to return. The arrival of this sad news proved to be not the only noteworthy event of the day. While I was still thinking of poor Mr. Engelmann, Fritz came into the office with his hat in his hand. "Minna is not in very good spirits this morning," he said. "I am going to take her out for half an hour to look at the shops. Can you come with us?" This invitation rather surprised me. "Does Minna wish it?" I asked. Fritz dropped his voice so that the clerks in the room could not hear his reply. "Minna has sent me to you," he answered. "She is uneasy about her mother. I can make nothing of it, and she wants to ask your advice." It was impossible for me to leave my desk at that moment. We arranged to put off the walk until after dinner. During the meal, I observed that not Minna only, but her mother also, appeared to be out of spirits. Mr. Keller and Fritz probably noticed the change as I did. We were all of us more silent than usual. It was a relief to find myself with the lovers, out in the cheerful street. Minna seemed to want to be encouraged before she could speak to me. I was obliged to ask in plain words if anything had happened to annoy her mother and herself. "I hardly know how to tell you," she said. "I am very unhappy about my mother." "Begin at the beginning," Fritz suggested. "Tell him where you went and what happened yesterday." Minna followed his instructions. "Mamma and I went to our lodgings yesterday," she began. "We had given notice to leave when it was settled we were to live in Mr. Keller's house. The time was nearly up, and there were some few things still left at the apartments which we could carry away in our hands. Mamma, who speaks considerately to everybody, said she hoped the landlady would soon let the rooms again. The good woman answered, 'I don't quite know, madam, whether I have not let them already.' Don't you think that rather a strange reply?" "It seems to require some explanation, certainly. What did the landlady say?" "The landlady's explanation explained nothing," Fritz interposed. "She appears to have spoken of a mysterious stranger who had once before inquired if Madame Fontaine was likely to leave the lodgings, and who came yesterday to inquire again. You tell him the rest of it, Minna." Before she could speak, I had already recognized the suspicious-looking personage whom Mr. Engelmann and I had some time since encountered on the doorstep. I inquired what the man had said when he heard that the lodgings were to let. "There is the suspicious part of it," cried Fritz. "Be very particular, Minna, to leave nothing out." Fritz's interruptions seemed only to confuse Minna. I begged him to be silent, and did my best to help her to find the lost thread of her story. "Did the man ask to see the lodgings?" I said. "No." "Did he talk of taking the lodgings?" "He said he wished to have the refusal of them until the evening," Minna replied, "and then he asked if Madame Fontaine had left Frankfurt. When the landlady said no, he had another question ready directly. He wanted to know in what part of Frankfurt Madame Fontaine was now living." "And the old fool of a landlady actually told him the address," said Fritz, interrupting again. "And, I am afraid, did some serious mischief by her folly," Minna added. "I saw mamma start and turn pale. She said to the landlady, 'How long ago did this happen?' 'About half an hour ago,' the landlady answered. 'Which way did he turn when he left you, towards Mr. Keller's house, or the other way?' The landlady said, 'Towards Mr. Keller's house.' Without another word, mamma took me by the arm. 'It's time we were home again,' she said. And we went back at once to the house." "You were too late, of course, to find the man there." "Yes, David, but we heard of him. Mamma asked Joseph if any one had called while we were out. Joseph said a stranger had called, and had inquired if Madame Fontaine was at home. Hearing that she was out, he had said, 'I think I had better write to her. She is here for a short time only, I believe?' And innocent Joseph answered, 'Oh dear, no. Madame Fontaine is Mr. Keller's new housekeeper.' "Well?" mamma asked, "and what did he say when he heard that?" "He said nothing," Joseph answered, "and went away directly." "Was that all that passed between your mother and Joseph?" "All," Minna replied. "My mother wouldn't even let me speak to her. I only tried to say a few words of sympathy, and I was told sharply to be silent. 'Don't interrupt me,' she said. 'I want to write a letter.'" "Did you see the letter?" "Oh, no! But I was so anxious and uneasy that I did peep over her shoulder while she was writing the address." "Do you remember what it was?" "I only saw the last word on it. The last word was Würzburg." "Now you know as much as we do," Fritz resumed. "How does it strike you, David? And what do you advise?" How could I advise? I could only draw my own conclusions privately. Madame Fontaine's movements were watched by somebody. Possibly in the interests of the stranger who now held the promissory note. It was, of course, impossible for me to communicate this view of the circumstances to either of my two companions. I could only suggest a patient reliance on time, and the preservation of discreet silence on Minna's part, until her mother set the example of returning to the subject. My vaguely prudent counsels were, naturally enough, not to the taste of my young hearers. Fritz openly acknowledged that I had disappointed him, and Minna turned aside her head with a look of reproach. Her quick perception had detected, in my look and manner, that I was keeping my thoughts to myself. Neither she nor Fritz made any objection to my leaving them, to return to the office before post time. I wrote to Mr. Engelmann before I left my desk that evening. Recalling those memorable days of my early life, I remember that a strange and sinister depression pervaded our little household from the time when Mr. Engelmann left us. In some mysterious ways the bonds of sympathy, by which we had been hitherto more or less united, seemed to slacken and fall away. We lived on perfectly good terms with one another, but there was an unrecognized decrease of confidence among us, which I for one felt sometimes almost painfully. An unwholesome atmosphere of distrust enveloped us. Mr. Keller only believed, under reserve, that Madame Fontaine's persistent low spirits were really attributable, as she said, to nothing more important than nervous headaches. Fritz began to doubt whether Mr. Keller was really as well satisfied as he professed to be with the choice that his son had made of a portionless bride. Minna, observing that Fritz was occasionally rather more subdued and silent than usual, began to ask herself whether she was quite as dear to him, in the time of their prosperity, as in the time of their adversity. To sum up all, Madame Fontaine had her doubts of me, and I had my doubts, although she had saved Mr. Keller's life, of Madame Fontaine. From this degrading condition of dulness and distrust we were roused, one morning, by the happy arrival of Mrs. Wagner, attended by her maid, her courier, and Jack Straw. End of chapter 22 of part 1.
Chapter 23 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 23. Circumstances had obliged my aunt to perform the last stage of her journey to Frankfurt by the night mail. She had only stopped at our house on her way to the hotel, being unwilling to trespass on the hospitality of her partners, while she was accompanied by such a half-witted fellow as Jack. Mr. Keller, however, refused even to hear of the head partner in the business being reduced to accept a mercenary welcome at an hotel. One whole side of the house, situated immediately over the offices, had been already put in order in anticipation of Mrs. Wagner's arrival. The luggage was then and there taken off the carriage, and my aunt was obliged, by all the laws of courtesy and good fellowship, to submit. This information was communicated to me by Joseph, on my return from an early visit to one of our warehouses at the riverside. When I asked if I could see my aunt, I was informed that she had already retired to rest in her room after the fatigue of a 7 hours' journey by night. "And where is Jack Straw?" I asked. "Playing the devil already, sir, with the rules of the house," Joseph answered. Fritz's voice hailed me from the lower regions. "Come down, David. Here's something worth seeing." I descended at once to the servants' offices. There, crouched up in a corner of the cold stone corridor which formed the medium of communication between the kitchen and the stairs, I saw Jack Straw again, in the very position in which I had found him at Bedlam, except in the prison, the chains and the straw. But for his prematurely grey hair, and the strange yellow pallor of his complexion, I doubt if I should have recognised him again. He looked fat and happy. He was neatly and becomingly dressed, with a flower in his buttonhole and rosettes on his shoes. In one word, so far as his costume was concerned, he might have been taken for a lady's page, dressed under the superintendence of the mistress herself. "There he is," said Fritz, "and there he means to remain till your aunt wakes and sends for him." "Upsetting the women servants on their way to their work," Joseph added, with an air of supreme disgust, "and freezing in that cold corner, when he might be sitting comfortably by the kitchen fire." Jack listened to this with an ironical expression of approval. "That's very well said, Joseph," he remarked. "Come here, I want to speak to you. Do you see that bell?" He pointed to a row of bells running along the upper wall of the corridor, and singled out one of them, which was numbered 10. "They tell me that's the bell of Mistress's bedroom," he resumed, still speaking of my aunt by the name which he had first given to her, on the day when they met in the madhouse. "Very well, Joseph. I don't want to be in anybody's way. But no person in the house must see that bell ring before me. Here I stay till Mistress rings, and then you will get rid of me. I shall move to the mat outside her door, and wait till she whistles for me. Now you may go. That's a poor half-witted creature," he said, as Joseph retired. "Lord, what a lot of them there are in this world!" Fritz burst out laughing. "I'm afraid you're another of them," said Jack, looking at him with an expression of the sincerest compassion. "Do you remember me?" I asked. Jack nodded his head in a patronizing way. "Oh, yes. Mistress has been talking of you. I know you both. You're David, and he's Fritz. All right, all right." "What sort of journey from London have you had?" I inquired next. He stretched out his shapely little arms and legs, and yawned. "Oh, a pretty good journey. We should have been better without the courier and the maid. The courier's a tall man. I have no opinion of tall men. I am a man myself of 5 foot. That's the right height for a courier. I could have done all the work, and saved Mistress the money. Her maid is another tall person, clumsy with her fingers. I could dress Mistress's hair a deal better than the maid, if she would only let me. The fact is, I want to do everything for her myself. I shall never be quite happy till I'm the only servant she has about her." "Ah, yes," said Fritz, good-naturedly sympathizing with him. "You're a grateful little man. You remember what Mrs. Wagner has done for you." "Remember?" Jack reported scornfully. "I say, if you can't talk more sensibly than that, you had better hold your tongue." He turned and appealed to me. "Did you ever hear anything like Fritz? He seems to think it wonderful that I remember the day when she took me out of Bedlam." "Ah, Jack, that was a great day in your life, wasn't it?" "A great day? Oh, good Lord in heaven! Where are there words that are big enough to speak about it?" He sprang to his feet, wild with the sudden tumult of his own recollections. "The sun, the warm, golden, glorious, beautiful sun! met us when we came out of the gates, and all but drove me stark staring mad with the joy of it. 40,000 devils, little straw-coloured, lively, tempting devils. Mind, I counted them. All crawled over me together. They sat on my shoulders, they tickled my hands, and they scrambled in my hair, and they were all in one cry at me like a pack of dogs. 'Now, Jack, we are waiting for you. Your chains are off, and the sun's shining, and mistress's carriage is at the gate. Join us, Jack, in a good yell, a fine, tearing, screeching, terrifying, mad yell.' I dropped on my knees down in the bottom of the carriage, and I held on by the skirts of mistress's dress. 'Look at me,' I said. 'I won't burst out. I won't frighten you if I die for it. Only help me with your eyes. Only look at me.' And she put me on the front seat of the carriage opposite her, and she never took her eyes off me all the way through the streets till we got to the house. 'I believe in you, Jack,' she said, and I wouldn't even open my lips to answer her, I was so determined to be quiet. Ha ha! How you two fellows would have yelled in my place!" He sat down again in his corner, delighted with his own picture of the two fellows who would have yelled in his place. "And what did Mistress do with you when she brought you home?" I asked. His gaiety suddenly left him. He lifted one of his hands and waved it to and fro gently in the air. "You are too loud, David," he said. "All this part of it must be spoken softly, because all this part of it is beautiful and kind and good. There was a picture in the room of angels and their harps. I wish I had the angels and the harps to help me tell you about it. Fritz there came in with us and called it a bedroom. I knew better than that. I called it heaven. You see, I thought of the prison and the darkness and the cold and the chains and the straw, and I named it heaven. You two may say what you please. Mistress said I was right." He closed his eyes with a luxurious sense of self-esteem, and appeared to absorb himself in his own thoughts. Fritz unintentionally roused him by continuing the story of Jack's introduction to the bedroom. "Our little friend," Fritz began confidentially, "did the strangest things when he found himself in his new room. It was a cold day, and he insisted on letting the fire out. Then he looked at the bedclothes and—" Jack solemnly opened his eyes again and stopped the narrative at that point. "You are not the right person to speak of it," he said. "Nobody must speak of it but a person who understands me. You shan't be disappointed, David. I understand myself. I'll tell you about it. You saw what sort of place I lived in and slept in at the madhouse, didn't you?" "I saw it, Jack, and I can never forget it." "Now just think of my having a room to begin with, and add, if you please, a fire, and a light, and a bed, and blankets, and sheets, and pillows, and clothes, splendid new clothes for me. And then ask yourself if any man could bear it, all pouring on him at once, not an hour after he had left Bedlam, without going clean out of his senses and screeching for joy? No, no. If I have a quality, it's profound common sense." Down I went on my knees before her again. "If you have any mercy on me, Mistress, let me have all this by a bit at a time. Upon my soul, I can't swallow it at once." She understood me. We let the fire out, and surprised that deficient person Fritz. A little of the Bedlam cold kept me nice and quiet. The bed that night if you like, but heaven defend me from the blankets and the sheets and the pillows till I'm able to bear them. And as to putting on coat, waistcoat, and breeches all together the next morning, it was as much as I could do when I saw myself in the breeches to give the word of command in the voice of a gentleman. Away with the rest of them! The shirt for tomorrow, the waistcoat for next day, and the coat, if I can bear the sight of it without screaming, the day after. A gradual process, you see, David. And every morning Mistress helped me by saying the words she said in the carriage. I believe in you, Jack. You ask her, when she gets up, if I ever once frightened her from the day when she took me home." He looked again with undiminished resentment at Fritz. "Now do you understand what I did when I got into my new room? Is Fritz in the business, David? He'll want a deal of looking after if he is. Just step this way. I wish to speak to you." He got up again, and taking my arm with a look of great importance, led me a few steps away, but not far enough to be out of sight of my aunt's bell. "I say," he began, "I've heard they call this place Frankfurt. Am I right?" "Quite right." "And there's a business here, like the business in London?" "Certainly." "And is Mistress here, like she is in London?" "Yes." "Very well, then. I want to know something. What about the keys?" I looked at him, entirely at a loss to understand what this last question meant. He stamped his foot impatiently. "Do you mean to say, David, you have never heard what situation I held in the London office?" "Never, Jack." He drew himself up, and folded his arms, and looked at me from the immeasurable height of his own superiority. "I was keeper of the keys in London," he announced. "And what I want to know is, am I to be keeper of the keys here?" It was now plain enough that my aunt, proceeding on the wise plan of always cultivating the poor creature's sense of responsibility, had given him some keys to take care of, and had put him on his honor to be worthy of his little trust. I could not doubt that she would find some means of humoring him in the same way at Frankfurt. "Wait till the bell rings," I answered, "and perhaps you will find the keys waiting for you in Mistress's room." He rubbed his hands in delight. "That's it," he said. "Let's keep watch on the bell." As he turned to go back again to his corner, Madame Fontaine's voice reached us from the top of the kitchen stairs. She was speaking to her daughter. Jack stopped directly and waited, looking round at the stairs. "Where is the other person who came here with Mrs. Wagner?" the widow asked. "A man with an odd English name. Do you know, Minna, if they have found a room for him?" She reached the lower stair as she spoke, advanced along the corridor, and discovered Jack Straw. In an instant her languid indifferent manner disappeared. Her eyes opened wildly under their heavy lids. She stood motionless, like a woman petrified by surprise, perhaps by terror. "Hans Grimm!" I heard her say to herself. "God in heaven, what brings him here?" End of Chapter 23 of Part 1. Chapter 24 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 1, Chapter 24. Almost instantaneously, Madame Fontaine recovered her self-control. "I really couldn't help feeling startled," she said, explaining herself to Fritz and to me. "The last time I saw this man, he was employed in a menial capacity at the University of Würzburg. He left us one day, nobody knew why, and he suddenly appears again, without a word of warning, in this house." I looked at Jack. A smile of mischievous satisfaction was on his face. He apparently enjoyed startling Madame Fontaine. His expression changed instantly for the better when Minna approached and spoke to him. "Don't you remember me, Hans?" she said. "Oh yes, Missy, I remember you. You are a good creature. You take after your papa. He was a good creature, except when he had his beastly medical bottles in his hand. But I say, I mustn't be called by the name they gave me at the university. I was a German then. I am an Englishman now. All nations are alike to me. But I am particular about my name, because it's the name Mistress knew me by. I will never have another. Jack Straw, if you please. There's my name, and I am proud of it. Lord, what an ugly little hat you have got on your head! I'll soon make you a better one." He turned on Madame Fontaine with a sudden change to distrust. "I don't like the way you spoke of my leaving the university just now. I had a right to go, if I liked, hadn't I?" "Oh yes, Hans." "Not Hans. Didn't you hear what I mentioned just now? Say Jack." She said it with a ready docility which a little surprised me. "Did I steal anything at the university?" Jack proceeded. "Not that I know of." "Then speak respectfully of me next time. Say, 'Mr. Jack retired from the university in the exercise of his discretion.'" Having stated this formula with an air of great importance, he addressed himself to me. "I appeal to you," he said. "Suppose you had lost your color here," he touched his cheek, "and your color there," he touched his hair. "And suppose it had happened at the university, would you," he stood on tiptoe and whispered the next words in my ear, "would you have stopped there to be poisoned again? No," he cried, raising his voice once more, "you would have drifted away like me, from Germany to France, from France to England, and so to London, and so under the feet of her Highness's horses, and so to Bedlam, and so to Mistress. Oh, Lord help me, I'm forgetting the bell! Good bye, all of you. Let me be in my corner till the bell rings." Madame Fontaine glanced at me compassionately and touched her head. "Come to my sitting room, Jack," she said, "and have something to eat and drink, and tell me your adventures after you left Wurzburg." She favored him with her sweetest smile, and spoke in her most ingratiating tones. That objectionable tendency of mine to easily suspect others was, I suppose, excited once more. At any rate, I thought the widow showed a very remarkable anxiety to conciliate Jack. He was proof, however, against all attempts at fascination. He shook his head obstinately, and pointed to the bell. We went our several ways, and left the strange little man crouched up in his corner. In the afternoon I was sent for to see my aunt. I found Jack at his post, established in a large empty wardrobe, on the landing outside his mistress's door. His fingers were already busy with the framework of the new straw hat, which he had promised to make for Minna. "All right, David?" he said, patronizing me as indulgently as ever. "Mistress has had her good sleep and her nice breakfast, and she looks lovely. Go in and see her. Go in." I thought to myself that she looked perhaps a little worn, and certainly thinner than when I had seen her last. But these were trifles. It is not easy to describe the sense of relief and pleasure that I felt, after having been accustomed to the sleepy eyes and serpentine graces of Madame Fontaine, when I looked again at the lithe active figure, and the bright well opened grey eyes of my dear little English aunt. "Tell me, David," she began, as soon as the first greetings were over, What do you think of Jack Straw? Was my poor dear husband not right? And have I not done well to prove it?" I could and did honestly congratulate her on the result of the visit to Bedlam. "And now, about the people here," she went on. "I find Fritz's father completely changed on the subject of Fritz's marriage; and when I ask what it means, I am told that Madame Fontaine has set everything right in the most wonderful manner by saving Mr. Keller's life. Is this true?" "Quite true. What do you think of Madame Fontaine?" "Ask me that, David, to morrow, or the next day. My head is muddled by traveling. I have not made up my mind yet." "Have you seen Minna?" "Seen her, and kissed her too. There's a girl after my own heart. I consider our scatter-brained friend Fritz to be the luckiest young fellow living." "If Minna was not going to be married," I suggested, "she would just do for one of your young lady clerks, wouldn't she?" My aunt laughed. "Exactly what I thought myself when I saw her. But you are not to make a joke of my young lady clerks. I am positively determined to carry out that useful reform in the office here. However, as Mr. Keller has been so lately ill, and as we are sure to have a fight about it, I will act considerately towards my opponent. I won't stir in the matter until he is quite himself again. In the meantime, I must find somebody, while I am away, to take my place in the London house. The business is now under the direction of Mr. Hartrey. He is perfectly competent to carry it on; but, as you know, our excellent head clerk has his old-fashioned prejudices. According to a strict rule, a partner ought always to be in command at the London business; and Hartrey implores me, if Mr. Keller is not well enough to take the journey, to send Mr. Engelmann to London. Where is Mr. Engelmann? How is it that I have neither heard nor seen anything of him?" This was a delicate and difficult question to answer, at least to my way of thinking. There was little prospect of keeping the poor old gentleman's sad secret. It was well known to Fritz and Minna, as well as to Mr. Keller. Still, I felt an unconquerable reluctance to be the first person who revealed the disaster that had befallen him. "Mr. Engelmann is not in good health and spirits," I said. "He has gone away for a little rest and change." My aunt looked astonished. "Both the partners ill!" she exclaimed. "I remember Mr. Engelmann, in the days when I was first married. He used to boast of never having had a day's illness in his life. Not at all a clever man, but good as gold, and a far more sensitive person than most people gave him credit for being. He promised to be fat as the years grew on him. Has he kept his promise? What is the matter with him?" I hesitated. My aunt eyed me sharply, and put another question before I had quite made up my mind what to say. "If you can't tell me what is the matter with him, can you tell me where he is? I may want to write to him." I hesitated again. Mr. Engelmann's address had been confidentially communicated to me, for reasons which I was bound to respect. "I am afraid I can't answer that question either," I said, awkwardly enough. "Good heavens!" cried my aunt. "What does all this mystery mean? Has Mr. Engelmann killed a man in a duel? Or run away with an opera dancer? Or squandered the whole profits of the business at the gambling table? Or what?" As she put these bold views of the case, we heard voices outside, followed by a gentle knock at the door. Minna entered the room with a message. "Mamma has sent me, Mrs. Wagner, to ask at what time you would like to dine." "My dear, I am much obliged to your mother. I have only just breakfasted, and I can wait quite well till supper time comes. Stop a minute. Here is my nephew driving me to the utmost verge of human endurance by making a mystery of Mr. Engelmann's absence from Frankfurt. Should I be very indiscreet if I asked? Good gracious, how the girl blushes! You are evidently in the secret too, Miss Minna. Is it an opera dancer? Leave us together, David." This made Minna's position simply unendurable. She looked at me appealingly. I did at last what I ought to have done at first. I spoke out plainly. "The fact is, aunt," I said, "poor Mr. Engelmann has left us for a while, sadly mortified and distressed. He began by admiring Madame Fontaine, and he ended in making her an offer of marriage." "Mamma was indeed truly sorry for him," Minna added, "but she had no other alternative than to refuse him, of course." "Upon my word, child, I see no 'of course' in the matter," my aunt answered sharply. Minna was shocked. "Oh, Mrs. Wagner, Mr. Engelmann is more than 20 years older than mamma. And I am sure I pity him, poor man. And so fat." "Fat is a matter of taste," my aunt remarked, more and more resolute in taking Mr. Engelmann's part. "And as for his being 20 years older than your mother, I can tell you, young lady, that my dear lost husband was 20 years my senior when he married me, and a happier couple never lived. I know more of the world than you do, and I say Madame Fontaine has made a great mistake. She has thrown away an excellent position in life, and has pained and humiliated one of the kindest hearted men living. No, no, I am not going to argue the matter with you now. I'll wait till you are married to Fritz. But I own I should like to speak to your mother about it. Ask her to favor me by stepping this way for a few minutes, when she has nothing to do." Minna seemed to think this rather a high-handed method of proceeding, and entered a modest protest accordingly. "Mamma is a very sensitive person," she began, with dignity. My aunt stopped her with a pat on the cheek. "Good child! I like you for taking your mother's part. Mamma has another merit, my dear. She is old enough to understand me better than you do. Go and fetch her." Minna left us, with her pretty little head carried high in the air. "Mrs. Wagner is a person entirely without sentiment," she indignantly whispered to me in passing, when I opened the door to her. "I declare that girl is absolute perfection!" my aunt exclaimed with enthusiasm. "The one thing she wanted, as I thought, was spirit, and I find she has got it. Ah! She will take Fritz in hand, and make something of him. He's one of the many men who absolutely need being henpecked. I prophesy confidently their marriage will be a happy one." "I don't doubt it, aunt. But tell me, what are you going to say to Madame Fontaine?" "It depends on circumstances. I must know first if Mr. Engelmann has really set his heart on the woman with the snaky movements and the sleepy eyes. Can you certify to that?" "Positively. Her refusal has completely crushed him." "Very well. Then I mean to make Madame Fontaine marry him always supposing there is no other man in his way." "My dear aunt, how you talk! At Madame Fontaine's age, with a grown-up daughter!" "My dear nephew, you know absolutely nothing about women. Counting by years, I grant you they grow old. Counting by sensations, they remain young to the end of their days. Take a word of advice from me. The evidence of their grey hair may look indisputable. The evidence of their grown-up children may look indisputable. Don't believe it. There is but one period in the women's lives when you may feel quite certain that they had definitely given the men their dismissal the period when they are put in their coffins. Hush! What's that outside? When there is a noisy silk dress and a silent foot on the stairs in this house, I know already what it means. Be off with you." She was quite right. Madame Fontaine entered, as I rose to leave the room. The widow showed none of her daughter's petulance. She was sweet and patient. She saluted Mrs. Wagner with a sad smile, which seemed to say, "Outrage my most sacred feelings, dear madam; they are entirely at your disposal." If I had believed that my aunt had the smallest chance of carrying her point, I should have felt far from easy about Mr. Engelman's prospects. As it was, I left the two ladies to their fruitless interview, and returned composedly to my work. Chapter 24 of Part 1.